Hello. In class today we did solving for basic percents. And we have done this with the bar models, and now we're just doing it without the bar models. That's what we're working on this week, is how to do without the bar models. Now, if you prefer, you are definitely more than welcome to continue using the bar models. So, when we're solving for basic percents, when we look at a problem, we see the word of. The word of is going to tell me to multiply. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to have to change the percent. Now you can change it to either a decimal, or what you guys did last year was you changed it to a fraction. Both of these will work. I don't care which one you use. You just need to feel comfortable with it and using it all the time. And so once you change it to a fraction or a decimal, you will multiply by the fraction or decimal. You will multiply the fraction or decimal by, got ahead of myself there, by the number. So let's take a look at what that looks like. It says, what is 65% of 40? We can also think about this like an equation, which is not a bad habit to get into. So the what would be our variable because we don't know what it is. The word is the equal sign. 65%, so we need to write that as either a decimal or a fraction. And on Friday we did a mental math lesson on the fact that when you want to change a percentage to a decimal, you just have to move the decimal 2 places to the left. You can also think about it as dividing it by 100, which is what you guys worked on last year when you talked about fractions. So when you talked about it with fractions, it was whatever that number was, so 65 in this case, over top of 100. Now the word of, as we saw above, means to multiply. So we're going to multiply that times 40. And if I put that over top of a 1, now we just have fraction multiplication. If you wanted to change it into a decimal, it would be the same thing, only my decimal would look like that. Now this decimal is the result of that division problem, because as you remember, every fraction is a division problem. I can do both of these fully in my calculator because I would do 65 times 40, and I end up then dividing by 100. And then I would also do 0.65 times 40, and I would not have to divide by 100 because I have already divided by 100 to get the decimal point right there. And both of these end up with an answer of 26. So you can see either way you want to go there, it will work. Bar model will also still work. You could have done mental math on that one. We talked about on Friday finding 10% of 40, which would be 4. And I need 6 of those because I'm at 60, so 4 times 6 is 24. And then half of the 4, because I have a 5 there for the 5%. So 5% is half of 10%, so half of 4 is 2, so 24 plus 2 would be 26, if you can follow that logic. My next one says, what is 13% of 75? So once again, I can set it up like this with a fraction, and like this with a decimal. And either way, I'm going to get this answer. And if you want to pause this at any time and try them out to see if you are getting the same answers as I am, but trying it yourself before you check, that would be fantastic. The last one says, what is 250% of 85? Now you might not put that 0 there, and that's okay. When I do that, I get x equals 212 and a half. And so we talked about in class, why on this particular problem, my answer ends up being higher than the number that I started with. Whereas here, when I did the problem, my number is only a small part. My answer, rather, is only a small part of the number I started with. And so we talked about the fact that when you multiply by a percent bigger than 100, your number that you started with is going to get bigger. My answer is going to be bigger than what I started with. But when I multiply times a percent that's less than 100, I'm going to end up with less than 100% of the number, which gives me a smaller number than I started with. Our first word problem here, we have a car company and they found that 3% of all headlights are defective after 2 months. So if they recently received a shipment of 1,350 or 1,350 headlights, approximately how many of the headlights may be defective? So I want to find 3% of the headlights, and I've got 1,350 headlights. So I'm going to turn that 3%, once again, I can turn it into a fraction, or I can turn it into a decimal. Just make sure that you write it, we talked about, as 3 cents, so that extra 0 gets in there. Don't make it 30 cents, that'd be a whole lot different. When I find the answer to this one, I get 40.5. And so that means that there's approximately, because they've gotten that 3% by finding averages from a lot of different shipments. So approximately 40.5 headlights may be defective. I want you to pause it right now, and I want you to try out the next problem, setting it up and answering it, and then I want you to start it back up and see if you're right. So, as you can see, if you check out this problem, we did 80% of 2,125. We wrote that in the 2 different ways that you might want to use, and found out that this year's budget is $1,700. Remember, you're doing word problems, so you need a sentence, and your sentence should not start with a number, so you can't say $1,700 is this year's budget. You want to say this year's budget is $1,700, and approximately 40.5 headlights may be defective. We start with a capital letter, we end with a period. We want to make sure that we look like smart mathematicians who are also literate. I want you to go ahead and pause the video again, and I want you to try the next problem and then unpause it and check it, and then do the same thing with the last one. The last one, there's a couple of different ways you could approach it, so I might talk through that one. We'll just see. So Mr. Cross earned $30,000, as we can see. He put 10% of that into his retirement. He put 30% of that into his mortgage. So we found 10% of $30,000 and 30% of $30,000 respectively there. Now I did it as fractions. You might have done it as decimals. And so my decimal would have been 0.1 times 30,000. Now you could have also done that mentally, because we just did mental math on Friday, and you should know how to find 10% and then find 30. Because you find 10% and then you multiply it by 3. When I add those two together, I get $12,000 that he has spent so far. But the question says, how much money is left over? And it's very important. First step in the 7 steps to problem solving is that you make sure you're answering the question that's being asked. Since it said how much is left over, I'm going to have to do 30,000 minus the 12,000 to find out that Mr. Cross has $18,000 left over. I'm sure he will probably be using that to buy food and such, obviously. So it's not just like, he's off partying, but he's got $18,000 left to live on. So our last question, there are 600 students at the middle school altogether, and the middle school is made up of 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Now 25% of these students are 6th graders. So the 6th grade is 25% of 600. And then it says the 1/3 of the students are 8th graders. So the 8th grade is 1/3 of the students. And then it says, well, we want to know how many 7th graders there are. So in order to do this, we're going to figure out how many 6th graders there are, how many 8th graders there are, and then we figure out what's left over, because whatever's left over must be how many 7th graders we have. So 25% of 600. I'll go decimal this time since I went fraction on the last one. And so that's 150 students. Down here, I've got 1/3 of 600. It's pretty much already set up for me. So far, I have accounted for 350 of the students. Since I had 600 students to begin with, that leaves me with 250 7th graders. Now you should be able to go in and you are going to go to Schoology. And in Schoology, you're going to go to the classwork folder. It's called the Unit Classwork folder. You are going to go to Topic 3/6. And there are 2 that say Learning Target 2, Day 2. And you're going to do both of those. One will simply practice turning fractions to decimals and decimals to percents and such. The other one will look a lot like this page. And so you need to make sure that you do both of those.